Chapter 1. The Beautiful Prisoner. The cold in the cellar was not merely a drop in temperature, it was a living, breathing malice that settled deep within the marrow of the bone. It smelled of ancient damp, of earth that had never tasted the sun. And tonight, it smelled of iron and blood. Mira pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the fabric offered little defense against the subterranean chill. Her boots scraped softly against the rough-hewn stone steps as she descended, the flickering torch in her hand casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to claw at the damp walls. "Faster, girl." A voice boomed from the darkness below. It was a voice like grinding gravel, harsh, unyielding, and devoid of warmth. Mira flinched, instinctively hurrying her pace. "I am coming, father." Garrick, the master hunter of their village, stood at the base of the stairs, his silhouette imposing against the heavy iron door of the lowest dungeon. He was a man carved from the same harsh landscape that surrounded their village, broad-shouldered, scarred, and driven by a fanatical obsession that had long ago eclipsed his capacity for fatherly affection. To him, Mira was not a daughter. She was a pair of hands to sew wounds, a back to carry loads, and an asset to be managed. Tonight, however, his eyes gleamed with a terrifying triumph. "Prepare yourself," Garrick sneered, his hand resting on the heavy iron latch. "You've wept over rabbits and nursed broken-winged sparrows. Let us see if you have the stomach for a true beast." "What have you caught?" Mira asked, her voice barely a whisper. The village had been buzzing with rumors of a grand hunt, of a prize so rare it would secure Garrick's favor with the king himself. "Not a what, Mira. The king of them all." With a metallic screech that echoed like a scream, Garrick threw the heavy door open. The stench hit her first, not the foul odor of filth she expected, but the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood mixed with the acrid scent of burnt hair and ozone. Mira stepped into the chamber, raising her torch. The light spilled into the gloom, revealing a cage within the room, constructed of thick bars reinforced with silver filaments, and inside the cage lay a legend. It was massive, far larger than any timber wolf Mira had ever seen or read about in her herbalist tomes. Its fur was the color of moonlight on snow, a brilliant, shimmering silver that seemed to hold its own luminescence even in the dark. But the majesty of the creature was marred by brutality. Thick, heavy chains were shackled around the wolf's neck and powerful paws. The metal was not ordinary iron. It was etched with glowing runes, pulsing with a faint, cruel light. Where the manacles touched the silver fur, the skin was seared black. The beast lay on its side, panting heavily, each breath a ragged rattle that shook its massive ribcage. "The last alpha of the Silvermane," Garrick announced, his voice trembling with greed. "Look at him. Bound in ensorcelled silver. He cannot shift, he cannot speak, and he can barely move. He is mine." Mira felt a wave of nausea. But it was not from disgust at the beast. It was horror at the cruelty. She stepped closer to the bars, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The wolf was still, but as she approached, a low vibration filled the air too deep to be a growl, too rhythmic to be a snarl. It was a warning. He is hurt," Mira murmured, her eyes tracing the burns where the silver chains ate into his flesh. "He is secured," Garrick corrected sharply. He turned to her, his face twisting into a scowl. "And he must stay alive until the king's convoy arrives in 3 days. If he dies, the glory dies with him. And if the glory dies, you will wish you were in that cage." He shoved a bucket of raw, grisly meat and a pail of water toward her with his boot. "Go in. Feed it. Clean the wounds just enough to keep the infection from killing it. Do not waste the good salves." Mira looked at the heavy iron gate of the cell, then back at her father. "You want me to go inside? With a werewolf? He is bound, you foolish girl. The runes neutralize his strength. He is no more dangerous than a cripple now. Do your work. I have celebratory wine to drink." Garrick tossed a heavy iron key ring onto the dirty straw at her feet, then turned on his heel. He didn't look back. The heavy outer door slammed shut, and the lock clicked, leaving Mira alone in the crushing silence of the dungeon. For a long moment, she didn't move. The torch sputtered, casting the shadow of the bars across her face. A monster, the village stories said. Soulless killing machines. Mira looked through the bars. The wolf hadn't moved, but she could feel the weight of its attention. Slowly, terrified but driven by an instinct she couldn't name, she knelt and retrieved the keys. "I'm not gonna hurt you," she whispered. The sound of her own voice felt absurdly small in the stone room. She unlocked the cell door. The mechanism groaned, a harsh intrusion on the quiet. Mira picked up the water pail and the rag she kept in her apron pocket. Stepping into the cage, the temperature dropped instantly. It was strange. The room was cold, but the air around the wolf crackled with a dry, static intensity. It was the feeling of standing beneath a thunderhead before the lightning strikes. She stopped 3 feet away from the beast's head. Up close, the sheer size of him was overwhelming. Even lying down, his shoulder was nearly as high as her waist. The silver fur was matted with dried blood and dungeon grime. "I need to clean the burns," she said softly, her hands trembling as she dipped the rag into the water. "Please." The wolf's ear twitched a subtle, fluid motion. Then, he opened his eyes. Mira gasped and took a stumbling step back. The water sloshing over the rim of the pail. They were not the yellow eyes of a predator, nor the black eyes of a beast. They were violet. A deep, crystalline purple, like amethyst veins in a dark cave, rimmed with a ring of shattered gold. They were ancient eyes. They held no chaotic rage, only a profound, terrifying intelligence. He watched her. He didn't bare his fangs. He didn't struggle against the chains. He simply held her gaze with a scrutiny that made her feel as though he were stripping away her skin to look at the soul beneath. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "I am Mira," she whispered, feeling foolish for introducing herself to a wolf, yet unable to treat him as anything less than a person. "My father. He did this. I am sorry," the wolf exhaled. A huff of air from his nose that stirred the dust on the floor. His gaze shifted from her face to the water bucket, then back to her. He was thirsty. Swallowing her fear, Mira stepped forward again. She moved slowly, telegraphing every action, just as she did when approaching a wounded stag in the forest. She knelt beside his massive head. The heat radiating from his body was immense, a furnace burning beneath the winter coat. It was a stark contrast to the biting chill of the stones pressing against her knees. She lifted the bucket. The chains clinked a terrible, heavy sound as the wolf strained his neck forward. The runas on the silver collar flared with a cruel red light, searing his skin. The wolf flinched, a ripple of pain shuddering through his massive frame, but he did not make a sound. He endured it with a stoic pride that broke Mira's heart. "Wait," she breathed, setting the bucket down. "The chain is too tight." She reached out. Her hand, small and pale, hovered over the thick, lethal muscle of his neck. This was madness. One snap of his jaws could take her arm, one thrash of his body could crush her against the wall. But the violet eyes watched her, unblinking. "Trust me," she thought, projecting the intent with all her might. "I am trying to help." She touched him. The shock was electric. His fur was coarser than she expected, but beneath it, the skin was fever-hot. The contact seemed to freeze time. She could feel the thrum of his pulse, slow and powerful, beating against her palm like a war drum. The wolf went impossibly still. He did not pull away. He did not growl. He allowed her touch. Mira worked quickly, her fingers deft from years of grinding herbs and stitching cuts. She couldn't remove the collar. The lock was magical, requiring a key she didn't possess, but she could shift the angle where the silver bit deepest into the raw flesh. She pulled a small jar of salve from her pocket, calendula and comfrey, meant for her own dry hands. She smeared the cool, green paste onto the angry burns around the collar. The wolf released a long, shuddering breath. His eyelids drooped slightly. The tension in his shoulders, which had been coiled tight as a spring, eased by a fraction. "Better?" she asked softly. She held the water bucket up to his muzzle again. This time, he drank. His tongue lapped at the water with desperate thirst, but even in his desperation, he was careful not to knock the bucket from her grasp. When the water was gone, Mira sat back on her heels, ignoring the cold seeping into her legs. She looked at the plate of raw, bloody meat her father had sent. It looked revolting, thrown onto the dirty floor. "I won't make you eat off the stone," she murmured. She used the hem of her apron to wipe a clean spot on a flatter stone nearby and placed the meat there. The wolf didn't eat immediately. He turned his head, the silver chains clinking softly, and looked at her again. The intensity of that violet gaze was almost too much to bear. It felt intimate, intrusive, and strangely grounding. In the village, Mira was invisible. To her father, she was a tool. To the villagers, she was the hunter's quiet daughter, fading into the background. But here, in the dark, with a monster of legend, she was seen. "You aren't a monster, are you?" she whispered, the realization settling over her like a heavy cloak. "You are a king." The wolf shifted, sliding his massive front paws forward until one of them rested mere inches from her knee. It was a gesture of allowance, a truce. From upstairs, the sound of heavy boots and a drunken shout echoed down the stone shaft. Her father was celebrating. The wolf's ears flattened against his skull, and a low, silent snarl curled his lip, revealing the gleam of ivory fangs. The hostility was palpable, filling the small cell with the pressure of a gathering storm. "I have to go," Mira said, panic spiking in her chest. She scrambled to her feet, her movements sudden and clumsy. The wolf's gaze snapped back to her. The aggression vanished instantly, replaced by that solemn, watchful calm. She backed out of the cage, locking the door with trembling hands. The click of the lock felt like a betrayal. "I will come back," she promised, gripping the bars. "I will bring blankets. It is too cold for you here." The silver wolf watched her, his head resting on his paws. As she turned to leave, taking the light with her, she looked back one last time. In the crushing darkness of the dungeon, the only light remaining was the faint, defiant glow of his violet eyes, watching her ascend into the world that wanted him dead. Chapter 2. The Silent Connection. The passing of 2 days did not bring sunlight to the dungeon. Time in the underbelly of Garrick's stronghold was measured not by the arc of the sun, but by the rhythmic dripping of condensation from the vaulted ceiling and the rattling of the guards' keys 3 floors above. For Mira, however, time was measured in heartbeats, the frantic, skipping rhythm of her pulse every time she stole down the stone steps. The manor above was a chaotic storm of noise. Garrick was preparing for the king's convoy. The halls echoed with the heavy thud of boots, the sharpening of steel, and the boisterous, drunken laughter of hunters anticipating a payout. Mira moved through them like a ghost, head down, hands busy, rendering herself invisible. But down here, in the cold dark, she was real. She pushed the heavy oak door open with her hip, balancing a tray in her hands. The air was frigid, a damp breath that bit through her dress. But the moment she crossed the threshold, the oppressive atmosphere shifted. The darkness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. "I brought you something," she whispered, her voice carrying easily in the stone acoustics. In the center of the cage, the massive mound of silver fur stirred. Lucian raised his head. Those violet eyes, luminous and sharp, locked onto her instantly. There was no growl, no baring of teeth, just a silent, intense acknowledgement of her return. Mira approached the bars, her fear from the first night having eroded into a dull, persistent ache of sympathy. She set the tray down. It wasn't the slop the kennel master had prepared. She had stolen a portion of roasted venison from the main kitchen, hiding it beneath a napkin, along with a thick wedge of bread. But more importantly, she had brought a bundle tucked under her arm. "The stones will suck the heat right out of your bones," she murmured, kneeling on the hard floor. "I've seen it happen to the hounds. They get stiff come morning." She unfolded a heavy quilt, a patchwork of wool she had stitched herself during long winter evenings. It smelled of dried lavender and the wood smoke of the hearth, a stark contrast to the dungeon's stench of mildew and iron. She pushed the quilt through the bars, bunching it up so it wouldn't drag in the dirt. The wolf watched her hands. He seemed to understand the risk she was taking. If Garrick found a household quilt in the beast's cage, the punishment would be severe. Lucian rose slowly. The silver chains hissed against the stone, and the rune-etched collar flared with a dull, angry red light. As he moved, he winced. A subtle tightening of his eyes. But he dragged his heavy body toward the offering. He didn't tear the blanket or sniff it with animalistic suspicion. Instead, he nosed it gently, gathering it with his paws to create a barrier between his flank and the freezing floor. He looked at her then, and gave a slow, deliberate blink. "Thank you." The intelligence in that gaze made Mira's chest tighten. It was wrong to keep a creature like this in the dark. It was a sin against nature itself. "I can't stay long," she said, though she made no move to leave. She sat cross-legged on the cold floor, just outside the reach of his claws. "Father is. He is in a mood today. The snow is heavy on the pass, and he worries the king's men will be delayed." The wolf rested his chin on his paws, his ears swiveling forward. He was listening, not just hearing the sounds, but listening to the cadence of her voice. "If they are delayed," Mira whispered, picking at a loose thread on her apron, "he will be angry. And when he is angry, he hunts." She looked at the wolf. "Do you have a pack?" Out there in the silver wood, Lucian's eyes darkened. A low, vibrating sound rumbled in his chest, a sound of mourning, deep and resonant as a cello string. He shifted, turning his gaze toward the high, barred window where a single sliver of moonlight failed to penetrate the gloom. "I am sorry," Mira breathed. "I shouldn't ask." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small sachet of dried herbs, chamomile and valerian. "I brought these, too. If the pain from the silver is too much, I can mix them into the water. It helps the mind sleep, even if the body hurts." The wolf turned back to her. He extended one massive paw, sliding it through the bars until it rested inches from her knee. The claws were black and sharp as obsidian daggers, yet he held them still. It was an invitation. Hesitantly, Mira reached out. She didn't touch his paw directly, but she laid her hand on the stone floor next to it. The heat radiating from him was palpable, a physical force that warmed the air between them. "I wish I could show you the Wintershade Garden," she said softly, her voice taking on a dreamlike quality she rarely allowed herself to use. "It's the only thing that thrives in this cold. The flowers are small, like little white bells. My mother planted them before she died. She used to say that beauty is most important when the world is ugliest." She looked around the dungeon walls, slick with grime. "This is a very ugly place. I think you are the only beautiful thing that has ever been down here." The wolf went perfectly still. His violet eyes widened slightly, the pupils dilating. He watched her with a fierce, unwavering intensity that made Mira blush and look away. The peace of the dungeon was shattered later that night. Mira was in the scullery, scrubbing the grease from the feast platters, her hands raw and red from the icy water. The door banged open, hitting the stone wall with a crack that made her jump. Garrick stood there, swaying slightly. His face was flushed with wine, but his eyes were cold shards of flint. "Where is the reserve key?" he barked. Mira froze, the scrub brush dripping in her hand. The key, father. The key to the wine cellar," he roared, crossing the room in 2 long strides. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep hard enough to bruise. "Do not play the fool with me, girl. I know you've been sneaking about, hiding things." Mira's heart stopped. "He knows about the dungeon. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, shrinking away from the sour smell of his breath. "The herbs." Garrick shoved her back against the sink. "I found your drying rack empty. The valerian. The poppy. Where are they?" "I used them," she gasped, clutching her arm. "For the horses." The mare was colicky. It was a lie. Flimsy as a spider web. Garrick stared at her, his jaw working. For a moment, she thought he would strike her, his hand raised, a heavy fist that had taught her the meaning of fear since childhood. But then he sneered, lowering his hand with a disgusted grunt. "Wasting medicine on beasts. You are soft, Mira. Soft and weak. Just like your mother. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a serpentine hiss. If I find you are wasting my resources again, I will throw you in the cage with the wolf. Let us see how much he appreciates your healing then. He turned and stormed out, knocking a stack of copper pans to the floor with a deafening clatter. Clean this up, he yelled over his shoulder. Mira stood trembling in the kitchen, the silence rushing back in to fill the void he left. Tears, hot and stinging, welled in her eyes. It wasn't the pain in her arm that made her cry, it was the suffocating weight of her existence. The feeling of being small, trapped, and utterly alone in a house full of monsters. She couldn't stay here. Not right now. Without thinking, she grabbed the spare lantern and ran. Down the hall, through the heavy door, and down the spiraling stone steps. She didn't stop until the iron door of the dungeon clicked shut behind her, sealing out the world above. She collapsed against the wall opposite the cage, sliding down until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest and buried her face in her arms, trying to stifle the sobs that racked her body. She didn't want the wolf to see her like this. She wanted to be strong. But the fear was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. Soft, weak, useless. The words echoed in her mind, louder than her own thoughts. A sound cut through her weeping. Clink. Drag. Clink. It was the heavy, wet sound of metal on stone. Mira lifted her head, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Lucian was moving. He had left the comfort of the quilt she had given him. He was standing right at the bars, as close as the chains would allow. The silver collar was pulled taut, the runes glowing angrily against his neck, sizzling against the burns. Don't, she whispered, her voice cracking. You'll hurt yourself. Go back. He ignored her. He pressed his massive shoulder against the iron bars, straining against the leash. He let out a soft whine, a sound so uncharacteristic of a predator that it startled her. He was calling to her. Mira sniffled, wiping her face again. Drawn by a force she couldn't resist, she crawled across the stone floor toward him. She stopped just in front of the bars. The wolf loomed over her, a mountain of silver shadow. Up close, she could smell him beneath the blood and the dungeon damp. He smelled of pine resin and ozone. He smelled like the wild. He lowered his great head. His ears were pinned back, his expression one of profound distress, mirroring her own. I'm sorry, she whispered, her hand hovering near the bars. I'm so tired. Lucian huffed, a warm blast of air that ruffled her hair. Then, slowly, carefully, he pushed his muzzle through the gap in the bars. He reached for her. Mira froze. His nose was wet and cold, but his fur was soft as velvet. He nudged her cheek, gentle as a falling leaf. He inhaled deeply, scenting the salt of her tears. Then, he pressed his forehead against hers. The contact was a shock to her system. It wasn't just physical, it felt like a door opening in her mind. A profound, grounding weight settled over her chaos. I am here. The gesture seemed to say. You are not alone. Mira's breath hitched. She closed her eyes, leaning into him. She brought her hands up, tangling her fingers into the thick ruff of fur at his neck, careful of the burning collar. You understand, don't you? She whispered into his fur. The wolf didn't pull away. He held her there, absorbing her trembling, his large body acting as a shield against the dark. A low rumble started in his chest again, but this time it wasn't a growl. It was a purr, rough, primal, and soothing. For the first time in her life, Mira felt safe. Not in her bed, not in the kitchen, but here, on a dungeon floor, forehead pressed against the forehead of a monster who was supposed to kill her. She opened her eyes. At this range, his violet eyes were entire galaxies. They held no judgment. They held only a fierce, protective recognition. He wasn't just an animal, and she wasn't just a hunter's daughter. They were two souls, bound in the dark, waiting for the light. Mira stayed there until the candle in her lantern burned low, drawing strength from his warmth, unaware that the bond forming between them was stronger than the iron bars, and far more dangerous than the silver chains. Chapter 3. The Night Escape. The sound of a whetstone singing against steel was a familiar torment in the hunter's lodge. It was a rhythmic, rasping hiss, clack, that usually signaled the end of a life. Mira stood in the shadows of the hallway, a heavy pewter pitcher of wine clutched in her hands. The oak door to her father's study was ajar, spilling a slice of yellow lantern light across the floorboards. "The snow is too deep at the Grey Pass," a gruff voice grumbled from within. It was Kaelin, her father's second in command. "The king's convoy won't make it through for another week, maybe 2. The pass is choked with ice." Garrick's shadow stretched long and distorted against the wall as he paced. 2 weeks. He spat. "I cannot keep that beast alive for 2 weeks. He refuses to eat the slop. He is wasting away. If I present a bag of bones to the king, I will be mocked, not rewarded." The whetstone paused. "So?" Kaelin asked. "So, we change the plan," Garrick said, his voice dropping to a low, greedy murmur that chilled Mira's blood. "A live alpha is a prize, yes. But a cloak made of the Silvermane's pelt, that is a treasure eternal. We kill him tonight." Mira's breath hitched in her throat. The pitcher trembled in her hands, the wine sloshing dangerously near the rim. "Tonight. At the witching hour," Garrick confirmed. "I want the pelt fresh. I'll strip the skin while the blood is still hot, to preserve the luster. Go sharpen the flaying knives. I will celebrate the kill before I even make it." The cruelty of it, the casual, butcher-like efficiency shattered something fragile inside Mira. She thought of Lucian in the dark, his violet eyes watching her with that silent, ancient intelligence. She thought of the way he had pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of comfort amidst his own agony. He was not a trophy, he was a soul. And her father was going to peel the skin from his body. "Not while I breathe," Mira thought. The thought was sudden, sharp, and terrifyingly clear. She retreated to the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She set the pitcher on the scarred wooden table. Her hands shook, but her mind was icy with purpose. She moved to the drying rack in the pantry. Her father thought she had used all the herbs on the horses, but Mira was a gatherer. She always kept a secret reserve. She reached behind a loose stone in the wall and pulled out a small, wax-sealed jar. Concentrated poppy and nightshade. In small doses, a painkiller. In a heavy dose, a coma-like sleep that would last until high noon. She uncorked the jar and tipped the entire contents into the pitcher of strong red wine. She swirled it, watching the powder dissolve into the crimson liquid until no trace remained. "Forgive me," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was asking, God, or the father she was about to betray. She smoothed her apron, fixed a mask of submissive quiet onto her face, and walked back to the study. The wait was agonizing. Mira stood in the corner of the study, pouring the wine, refilling goblets, and fading into the background as she had been trained to do. Garrick drank deeply, his mood shifting from angry impatience to a sloppy, boisterous anticipation. "To the Silver Wolf." Garrick toasted, raising his goblet high. "May his fur keep me warm in hell." He laughed, draining the cup. Mira watched his throat work, counting the swallows. 1, 2. The effects were not immediate. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Garrick's speech began to slur. His eyelids grew heavy, drooping over his cruel eyes. He slumped in his leather chair, the knife slipping from his loosening grip to clatter onto the floor. "Girl," he mumbled, his head lolling back. "Refill," but the command died on his lips. His chin hit his chest. A moment later, a snore ripped through the room, a harsh, grinding sound that was far more beastly than anything Lucian had ever uttered. Mira waited a full minute, her pulse roaring in her ears. She stepped forward. "Father," she whispered. No response, just the deep, rhythmic shudder of the drugged sleep. She moved. The silver key ring hung from his belt, resting against his hip. To get it, she had to touch him. She had to lean into the personal space of the man who had been the architect of her fear for 20 years. She held her breath, smelling the stale wine, the sweat, and the dried blood that always clung to his clothes. Her fingers grazed the cold metal of the keys. Garrick shifted in his sleep, grunting. Mira froze, her hand hovering over the leather belt. If he woke up now, he would kill her. There would be no dungeon, no cage, just the knife on the floor. Garrick settled again, sinking deeper into the chair. With the precision of a surgeon, Mira unhooked the ring. The metal jingled a tiny crystalline sound that seemed to scream in the quiet room. She caught the keys in her palm to silence them, backed away, and turned toward the door. She didn't run. Running attracted attention. She walked, swift and silent, her woolen socks dampening her footsteps on the stone. The descent into the dungeon felt different tonight. The cold didn't bite. It beckoned. Mira burst through the heavy iron door, abandoning stealth as she bolted down the stairs. The torch in the sconce had burned low, casting the room in a dying, amber twilight. Lucian was awake. He was standing in the center of the cage, his body rigid, his ears swiveled toward the door. He had heard her coming. He had heard the difference in her gait, the urgency, the panic. They are coming to kill you. Mira gasped, fumbling with the heavy lock of the cage door. Her hands were shaking so badly, she dropped the keys into the straw. Lucian let out a sharp chuff, a sound of command. Focus. Mira snatched the keys up, took a deep breath, and jammed the large iron key into the lock. It turned with a heavy thunk. She threw the gate open. She didn't stop there. She rushed into the cage, ignoring the overpowering aura of the predator, and fell to her knees beside him. The collar. She wept, her fingers scrabbling at the rune-etched silver around his neck. I have to get the collar off. The magic. It weakens you. Lucian held perfectly still, lowering his massive head to give her access. He could smell the fear rolling off her in waves, acrid and sharp, but beneath it, he smelled the sleeping draft she had handled, and the metallic tang of the keys. She had hunted the hunter for him. Mira found the small, intricate keyhole on the underside of the silver band. She inserted the smallest key from her father's ring. Click. The mechanism sprang open. The red glow of the runes died instantly, fading into dull gray metal. The effect was immediate. Lucian inhaled, a sound that sucked the air from the room. His muscles, previously tight and trembling from the silver's burn, swelled with sudden, returning power. He stood to his full height, shaking his fur out. The heavy iron chains fell from his limbs, clattering uselessly to the stone floor. He was free, and he was terrifying. Without the magical suppression, his presence filled the small cell. He was a creature of myth, a lethal engine of tooth and claw that could snap a man in half. He towered over Mira, his shadow swallowing her whole. Mira scrambled back, her back hitting the cold stone wall. The reality of what she had done crashed into her. She had released a monster. Lucian turned his head slowly. His violet eyes locked onto hers. They were glowing in the dark. Two burning coals of arcane power. He took a step toward her. Mira flinched, closing her eyes. But death did not come. Instead, she felt a wet, hot nudge against her hand. She opened her eyes. Lucian was bowing. He had lowered the front of his body, pressing his chest to the floor in a pose of submission, his head level with her chest. He nudged her hand again, then looked pointedly at his broad, silver shoulders. Then at the open door. Ride. You want me to come? Mira whispered. Lucian huffed impatiently, a growl vibrating in his throat. He looked at the stairs. He could hear what she could not. The stirring of the hounds in the kennels outside. They were running out of time. Mira looked at the open door. If she stayed, she would be found with the keys. Her father would wake. There was no life left for her in that house. Only gray servitude and fear. She looked at the wolf. In his eyes, she saw the wild. She saw danger, yes, but she also saw a partnership. He was waiting for her. He chose her. Okay, she breathed. She grabbed her cloak, throwing it over her shoulders. Then, grabbing a handful of his thick, silver mane, she swung her leg over his back. He was solid as a rock beneath her. The heat of him soaked instantly through her dress, chasing away the dungeon's chill. She buried her hands in his fur, gripping tight. I'm ready. Lucian moved. He didn't walk. He exploded into motion. He launched himself from the cell, his claws seeking purchase on the stone floor. He took the stairs 3 at a time, a blur of silver lightning. Mira buried her face in his neck, screaming silently as they burst through the upper door and into the main hall. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic snoring of her father in the study. Lucian didn't pause. He didn't look toward the study to seek revenge. His priority was the weight on his back. He skidded across the wooden floor of the entryway and slammed his shoulder into the main doors. The wood splintered and groaned, flying open under the force of an alpha in his prime. And then they were out. The night air hit Mira like a physical blow, crisp, freezing, and impossibly clean. The moon was high and full, painting the snow-covered world in shades of blue and white. Lucian didn't stop. He hit the snow and accelerated, his stride lengthening into a gallop that ate up the ground. Mira had ridden horses before, but this was different. A horse ran over the ground. The wolf moved with it. He flowed like water over roots and rocks, his body expanding and contracting in a rhythmic, powerful surge. Wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. But she didn't care. She laughed a broken, hysterical sound that was snatched away by the gale. Behind them, the manor grew smaller, a dark stain on the pristine landscape. A single shout echoed from the kennels, a guard raising the alarm, but it was too late. They were already ghosts in the tree line. Lucian dove into the tree line of the ancient forest. The canopy blocked out the moonlight, plunging them into shadow, but he didn't slow down. He knew these woods. He was the king here. Mira leaned forward, pressing her chest against his back, merging her heartbeat with his. The cold burned her cheeks, but the fire of the wolf beneath her warmed her soul. For the first time in 20 years, Mira was not just surviving. She was alive. Chapter 4. A peaceful refuge. The world was a blur of rushing wind and passing shadows, a chaotic tapestry woven from speed and fear. Mira had lost all sense of direction. She knew only the rhythmic, thundering impact of Lucian's paws against the frozen earth and the biting cold that stung her cheeks until they were numb. They had left the familiar hunting trails miles behind, crossing into the deep, tangled heart of the forbidden forest. A place where the trees grew so thick they blotted out the stars, and the silence was heavy with the weight of centuries. Gradually, the terrain began to rise. The smooth silence of the snow-covered forest was replaced by a low, vibrating roar that grew louder with every stride. Lucian slowed, his gallop breaking into a heavy, laboring trot. Mira could feel the heat radiating from his back, damp with sweat beneath the thick fur. His breathing was ragged, a harsh rasping in the crisp air. He had spent weeks in a cage, starved and tortured. Yet he had carried her this far on sheer will. They emerged into a clearing dominated by a cliff face of sheer obsidian rock. From high above, a waterfall plummeted into a dark, churning pool. In the summer, it would have been a majestic cascade. Now, in the heart of winter, the edges were frozen into jagged teeth of ice. And the water that fell was a freezing mist that coated everything in a glittering, diamond-like sheen. Lucian didn't stop at the water's edge. He moved directly toward the curtain of falling water. "Wait," Mira gasped, tightening her grip on his mane. "We'll drown." He ignored her, plunging onto a narrow, hidden ledge of slick stone that wound behind the waterfall. The roar was deafening, a physical pressure that vibrated in Mira's chest. Icy spray soaked her cloak instantly, chilling her to the bone. Then, just as suddenly, the noise muffled. They had passed through a fissure in the rock, entering a vast, natural cavern concealed behind the veil of water. Lucian's legs finally gave out. He didn't collapse, but he sank down heavily, his belly hitting the stone floor with a wet thud. Mira slid off his back, her legs trembling so violently she almost fell. She steadied herself against the cave wall. The air here was damp but still, and surprisingly, not as freezing as the outside. The cave seemed to hold the earth's own warmth deep within its belly. "Lucian," she whispered, her voice sounding small in the vast echo of the cave. The wolf lay on his side, his chest heaving. The adrenaline of the escape was fading, leaving behind the brutal reality of his condition. The silver burns on his neck and legs where the chains had rubbed raw during their flight were oozing, the flesh angry and inflamed. Mira's instincts as a healer overrode her exhaustion. She shrugged off her damp cloak, laying it on a dry patch of stone, and moved toward him. "You pushed yourself too hard," she chided gently, though her hands were shaking. "You stubborn, foolish king." Lucian opened one eye. The violet iris was dull, clouded with pain. He let out a low, weary whine, and nudged her knee with his nose, then let his head drop back onto his paws. "I am safe because of you," the gesture said. Mira looked around the cavern. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom, aided by the faint, phosphorescent moss clinging to the high ceiling like distinct stars. It was not just a bare cave. In the corner, there was a pile of dry driftwood, likely washed in during high spring floods and left to dry for years. "Fire first," she muttered to herself. "Then water. Then wounds." She moved with practiced efficiency. She had no flint, but she had the matches she kept in her apron pocket wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. A trick her mother had taught her. She gathered the driest twigs and some dried moss. The first match sputtered and died. The second flared to life. When the fire finally caught, crackling cheerfully and casting dancing orange shadows against the limestone walls, the atmosphere of the cave shifted. It became a sanctuary. Mira took the small metal cup from her belt, another tool of her trade, and walked to the cave entrance, where the water trickled down the rock face. She filled the cup and returned to the fire, setting it near the flames to warm. She knelt beside Lucian. The firelight revealed the extent of the damage. The runic burns were deep, the skin around his neck blistered and weeping. The fur was matted with blood and dungeon filth. "This will hurt," she warned him softly. She tore the hem of her petticoat, dipping the fabric into the warmed water. Lucian watched her. As she reached for his neck, his upper lip curled instinctively, a reflex of a creature in pain. A low growl rumbled in his throat, vibrating through the floor and into Mira's knees. She didn't pull back. She held his gaze, her own brown eyes steady and calm. "I know," she whispered. "I know it burns. But I have to clean the poison out." She waited. Slowly, the growl faded. Lucian turned his head away, exposing the vulnerable curve of his throat to her. It was an act of supreme trust. He was an alpha, a predator who should never show weakness, yet he was allowing a human hunter's daughter to tend to his most lethal wounds. Mira worked in silence. She cleaned the grime from the raw flesh, her touch feather light. Every time he flinched, she paused, humming a shapeless, soothing melody until his muscles relaxed. From her pocket, she retrieved the small satchel she had saved. She didn't have much, but she had yarrow for the bleeding and the last of the calendula salve. She chewed the yarrow leaves into a poultice, an old, primitive method, but effective, and pressed the green mash onto the worst of the burns. Lucian hissed, his claws scraping against the stone. But he didn't snap at her. "There," Mira breathed, wiping her hands on her apron. "The bleeding has stopped." She picked up the cup of water again. "Drink." She held it to his muzzle. He lapped at it, his rough tongue grazing her fingers. He drank one cup, then another, his thirst unquenchable. When he was finished, he didn't move away. He shifted his weight, dragging his massive body closer to the fire, and by extension, closer to her. Mira sat back, exhausted. Her own adrenaline had crashed, leaving her limbs feeling like lead. She looked at her hands stained with the blood of a werewolf, smelling of wild herbs and wet fur. "I can never go back," she said into the silence. The realization wasn't terrifying anymore. It was just a fact. Father will have the entire guild hunting us by sunrise. Lucian lifted his head. He looked at her, his gaze sharp and lucid. He reached out with a front paw and placed it heavily over her legs, pinning her gently to the ground. "You are not going back," he seemed to say. "You are with me." The cave grew quiet, save for the crackling of the wood and the distant, muffled roar of the waterfall. The cold was creeping in from the entrance, fighting the warmth of the small fire. Mira shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Her cloak was still damp, useless against the chill. Lucian observed her shiver. He rose, groaning slightly as his stiff muscles protested, and circled her. He moved behind her, curling his massive body into a tight crescent shape around her back. He lay down, pressing his warm, fur-covered flank against her spine. The heat was instantaneous and overwhelming. He was a living furnace. The scent of him, pine, rain, and musk enveloped her. It was the scent of safety. Mira stiffened for a moment, the old teachings of her father screaming in her head. Beasts are soulless. They kill, but the heart beating against her back was not soulless. It was strong, steady, and kind. She relaxed, leaning back into him. She reached behind her, burying her cold fingers into the thick silver fur of his flank. "Good night, Lucian," she whispered. He let out a long, contented breath, the sound vibrating through her ribs. His head came to rest on his paws, his nose just inches from her shoulder, guarding her even in sleep. Outside, the wind howled through the frozen trees, and the hunters sharpened their knives. But here, in the secret heart of the earth, protected by stone and water and the body of a king, Mira closed her eyes and slept without fear. Chapter 5. The Night of Transformation. The passing of time in the sanctuary of the cave was marked not by the tolling of the village bell, but by the slow, rhythmic healing of the wolf's body and the waning of the moon. For 3 days, they had existed in a quiet, fragile stasis. Mira ventured out only briefly to gather firewood and check the snares she had set for rabbits, her heart in her throat with every snap of a twig. But the snow was heavy, covering their tracks, and the waterfall masked their scent. They remained undiscovered. Inside the cavern, the dynamic had shifted. Lucian was no longer just a patient. He was a brooding, watchful presence. His strength was returning. He would pace the perimeter of the cave, his claws clicking on the stone, his violet eyes tracking the shadows with a restless energy that made the hair on Mira's arms stand on end. But tonight, the air felt different. It was the night of the new moon. Outside the curtain of water, the world was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The sky was a void, stripped of its celestial lantern. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with static. The air tasted metallic. Like the moment before a lightning strike, Mira sat by the fire, crushing dried willow bark between 2 stones to make a pain powder. She watched Lucian. He had been agitated all evening, refusing the water she offered, pacing in tight, frantic circles near the back of the cave where the mist from the waterfall was thickest. "Lucian," she called softly. "Is the pain worse?" He stopped. He turned his massive head toward her. And for a moment, Mira saw something wilder than usual in his gaze. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the violet irises. He let out a low, shuddering breath, half whine, half growl, and backed away from the firelight, retreating into the shadows near the water. He was hiding. "Stay back," the gesture seemed to say. Mira set her stones down, her hands trembling. "I won't hurt you," she whispered. Though she knew the threat was not from her. Lucian collapsed near the water's edge. His body began to tremble, a violent shaking that rattled his teeth. He threw his head back, his jaw opening in a silent cry of agony. Mira started to rise, her instinct to comfort him overriding her fear. Then, the light began. It did not come from the fire, it came from him. A soft, ethereal glow began to emanate from beneath his silver fur. It was the color of starlight, cool and pale. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat, brighter and brighter, until the silhouette of the wolf was lost within a blinding nimbus of silver radiance. Mira shielded her eyes, gasping. She had heard the stories, horror stories told by drunken hunters in the tavern. They said a shifter's transformation was a grotesque thing, a breaking of bones and tearing of skin, a punishment from the gods. But this was not horror. It was a miracle. There was no sound of snapping bone. There was only a fluid, rushing sound, like water flowing uphill. The massive, beastly shadow within the light began to shrink, to elongate, to rearrange itself. The fur seemed to dissolve into mist, and the snout receded. The light flared once, brilliant and silent, filling the cave with a flash that turned the obsidian walls to mirrors. And then, it faded. The massive silver wolf was gone. Lying on the cold stone, half submerged in the shallow pool of the cave floor, was a man. Mira stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The silence that followed was heavy and profound, broken only by the man's ragged, gasping breaths. He was stark naked, vulnerable against the harsh rock. He was long-limbed and lean, his body corded with the kind of muscle that came from survival. Not vanity. His skin was pale, almost luminous in the gloom, contrasting sharply with the wet, platinum hair that plastered to his skull and fell across his face. But it was the scars that drew Mira's eye. Without the thick coat of fur to hide them, the cruelty of her father's dungeon was laid bare. Angry, red welts circled his neck where the collar had been. Burns marred his wrists and ankles. A long, jagged line, an old hunting wound, perhaps traced the curve of his ribs. He tried to push himself up, his arms trembling with effort. He failed, collapsing back onto the stone with a groan that was undeniably human. The sound broke Mira's paralysis. She grabbed the woolen quilt from her sleeping spot and ran to him. She didn't think of propriety. She thought only of the biting cold and the shivering man on the floor. "Easy," she murmured, falling to her knees beside him. The water soaked her dress instantly, freezing her skin, but she ignored it. She threw the quilt over him, covering his nudity and his trembling frame. She tucked the edges under his shoulders, her hands brushing against skin that was burning hot to the touch. "Lucian," she asked, the name feeling strange on her tongue now that she was speaking it to a human face. He flinched at her touch, his instincts still raw. Slowly, he turned his head. Mira's heart skipped a beat. His face was striking high cheekbones that could cut glass, a strong, aristocratic jaw, and lips that were currently pale with exhaustion. He possessed a surreal, regal beauty that belonged in the tapestries of old kings, not in a damp cave. But the eyes were the same. Violet. Deep. Ancient, and filled with a sorrow so vast it threatened to drown her. He looked at her, blinking water from his lashes. He looked at her hands clutching the quilt, then up at her face. His expression was one of confusion, as if he couldn't quite reconcile the woman with the hunter's daughter. He opened his mouth. His throat worked, dry and unused to human speech. "Mira," he rasped. His voice was a ruin deep, gravelly, and broken by disuse. Yet, the sound of her name on his lips sent a shockwave through her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "I'm here," she whispered, her hands hovering over his shoulder, unsure if she was allowed to touch him now that he was a man. He squeezed his eyes shut, a grimace of pain tightening his features. He brought a hand up, a hand that was large, with long, elegant fingers, though the nails were cracked and dark, and touched the burns on his neck. "The silver," he groaned, his voice gaining a fraction of strength. "It lingers. I have a poultice," Mira said quickly. "For the burns. It helped the wolf. It will help you." She moved to get up, but his hand shot out, gripping her wrist. His fingers were strong, the grip desperate. "Do not go," he breathed. Mira froze. She looked down at where his skin touched hers. The contact was electric, far more intimate than when he was a wolf. This was skin against skin, man against woman. "I am only getting the medicine," she promised softly. "I am not leaving you." He searched her eyes for a moment, then slowly released her wrist. His hand fell back to the stone, the fingers curling inward. Mira fetched the jar of salve and the water skin. When she returned, he had managed to push himself into a sitting position, his back resting against the cave wall. He held the quilt tightly around his waist, his chest bare and heaving. She knelt beside him again. The shift in dynamic was dizzying. When he was a wolf, she was the caretaker, the dominant force of compassion. Now, even seated and wounded, he radiated a powerful, masculine authority that made her feel small. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to his neck. Lucian nodded once, tilting his head back. Mira scooped a bit of the green salve onto her fingers. Her hand trembled as she reached out. She touched the angry red skin of his throat. He hissed, his jaw clenching, the cords of his neck standing out in sharp relief. "I know," she murmured, falling back into her healer's rhythm. I know. Breathe. She worked the salve into the burns, her fingertips grazing the pulse point at his neck. His heart was hammering thud, 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 a frantic rhythm against her skin. Lucian watched her. He didn't look at the wall or the fire. He watched her face. His gaze was intense, tracing the curve of her jaw, the smudge of soot on her cheek, the softness of her mouth. Why? He asked suddenly. The word was rough, like stones grinding together. Mira paused, her fingers still on his neck. Why what? Why save me? He looked at her with a piercing scrutiny. You are Garrick's blood. You smell of his house. You smell of the iron that bound me. Mira pulled her hand back, wiping the excess salve on her apron. She looked down at her lap. I am his blood, she admitted, her voice quiet. But I am not his heart. He hunts for glory. He hurts for pleasure. She looked up, meeting Lucian's violet gaze. I heal because I cannot bear the pain of others. Even if they are monsters. Lucian let out a dry, humorless laugh. It was a dark sound. And am I a monster, Mira? No, she said firmly. A monster would have killed me the moment I opened the cage. You are. She struggled for the word. You are just a soul in pain. Lucian stared at her for a long time. The silence stretched, filled only by the roar of the waterfall outside. The damp air of the cave seemed to grow warmer, charged with the proximity of their bodies. He leaned forward slightly. The quilt slipped lower on his chest, revealing the definition of his torso in the firelight. He brought his face closer to hers, until she could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. It was the same motion he made as a wolf scenting the air, reading her pheromones. I have always despised the scent of humans, he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating register that seemed to caress her spine. They smell of greed, of fear, of rotting meat. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers, holding her captive. But I find I cannot hate yours. Mira's breath hitched. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. You smell of the earth, he continued, his voice hypnotic, of dried herbs and rain. And beneath that, he tilted his head, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. Beneath that, you smell of sorrow. He raised his hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before he brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she knew he was capable of. We are a pair then, little healer, he whispered. Two sorrowful things in the dark. Two sorrowful things. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. Mira felt a flush rise in her cheeks, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. She should pull away. She should be terrified. He was the Silver King, a being of immense power, and she was just a village girl. But she didn't pull away. She leaned just a fraction of an inch into his touch. Lucian, she whispered. He froze at the sound of his name, his eyes darkening. For a second, Mira thought he might kiss her. The air between them crackled with a magnetic pull, a gravity that wanted to collapse the distance. Then, he blinked, and the moment shattered. He pulled his hand back, wincing as a spasm of pain shot through his shoulder. The exhaustion of the transformation crashed over him. I must rest, he muttered, his voice strained. The human form. It is weak. Yes, Mira said breathlessly, scrambling backward to give him space. Yes. You should sleep. She busied herself with the fire, feeding it logs with unnecessary force, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Lucian lay back down, pulling the quilt up to his chin. But he didn't close his eyes immediately. He watched her silhouette against the flames, his expression unreadable, calculating, and undeniably possessive. As Mira curled up on her own pile of furs on the other side of the fire, she touched her forehead where he had brushed her hair. The skin still tingled. She stared into the darkness, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. She had saved a wolf, but she had awakened a man. and she had a terrifying feeling that the man would be infinitely more dangerous to her heart than the beast ever was. Chapter 6. Vibration Between Worlds. The days that followed Lucian's transformation were a strange, suspended reality. The cave, once a cold shelter for survival, had transformed into a small, enclosed world where the laws of the village did not apply. Lucian's recovery was unnatural in its speed. The burns that would have festered on a human for weeks began to knit together within days. The angry red skin fading to a pale, silvery pink, but while his body healed, his nature remained a volatile paradox. He was a man. Yes. He walked on two legs, he wore the makeshift tunic Mira had fashioned from the extra blankets, and he spoke with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. But he moved like a wolf. He did not walk. He stalked. He did not sit idly. He crouched. His muscles coiled, ready to spring. When Mira cooked the meager rabbit stew over the fire, he did not ask if it was ready. He would inhale deeply, his nostrils flaring, and simply nod when the scent changed from raw to roasted. Mira found herself watching him constantly, drawn to the alien grace of his movements. "You are staring," Lucian said. He was sitting near the cave entrance, whittling a spear from a piece of hardened ash wood. He didn't look up, yet he knew exactly where her eyes were. Mira flushed, stirring the pot vigorously. "I was checking your bandages from here. To see if the bleeding started again." Lucian paused. He raised his head, his violet eyes catching the firelight. A corner of his mouth quirked upward, not quite a smile, but a softening of his severe features. "You are a terrible liar, Mira." He set the wood down and rose. The cave felt smaller instantly. He crossed the distance between them with silent, predatory strides. He stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, contrasting sharply with the draft from the entrance. "You move too loudly," he murmured, his voice near her ear. Mira stiffened, the spoon freezing in her hand. I am trying to be quiet." "You stomp," he corrected gently. "You treat the ground as something to be conquered, something to push against. That is the way of the hunter." He reached out, placing his large hands on her shoulders. His touch was heavy, grounding. "To survive the forest, you must not push. You must ask permission. Close your eyes." "Lucian, close them." She obeyed. The darkness behind her eyelids heightened her other senses. She could hear the popping of the fire, the distant roar of the waterfall, and the steady, slow rhythm of Lucian's breathing behind her. "What do you hear?" he asked. "The water," she whispered. "The wind in the trees. The fire. Surface sounds." He dismissed. "Deeper. Listen to the vibration between the worlds." He slid his hands down her arms to her elbows, guiding her posture, relaxing the tension in her spine. "The forest is not a collection of trees. It is a single breath. The owl's wing beats the same rhythm as the mouse's heart. Listen for the silence between the sounds." Mira focused. She tried to push past the obvious noise. She stood there for a long time, held by the Wolf King, until her breathing slowed to match his, and then she heard it. It wasn't a sound. Exactly. It was a sensation. The subtle thrum of the earth, the creak of the ice shifting on the cliff face miles away, the scuffle of a fox in the snow far below. The world suddenly felt immense, interconnected, and alive. She gasped, her eyes flying open. "I heard it," she breathed, turning to look at him. It sounded like a heartbeat. Lucian looked down at her, his expression intense. "It is the pulse of the wild. You have the gift, Mira. You have the hands of a healer, but you have the soul of a listener. Your father," his lip curled in a sneer. A flash of the beast surfacing. "He is deaf to it. He hears only death." Mira looked away, the reminder of her father piercing the moment like a shard of ice. "I am his daughter. Perhaps I am deaf, too. And I am only imagining things." Lucian reached out, gripping her chin with his thumb and forefinger. He forced her to look at him. His skin was rough, calloused from years of running, but his grip was tender. "Blood does not define the spirit," he said fiercely. "If it did, I would be a monster who devours you. And you would be the cage that binds me." We are what we choose to be. Later that night, the clouds that had choked the sky for weeks finally broke. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of polished obsidian scattered with diamonds. The air was brutally cold, sharp enough to freeze the breath in one's lungs, but the beauty of the night was irresistible. Lucian beckoned her to the ledge outside the cave, behind the veil of the waterfall. They sat side by side on a large, flat rock, wrapped in every fur and blanket they possessed. The mist from the falls had frozen on the nearby rocks, creating a cathedral of glittering ice sculptures. Mira huddled deep into her cloak, watching the stars reflect in the black pool below. I used to watch the stars from my window, she said softly. I named them. The hunter, the weaver, the lost child. She pointed to a cluster of bright stars near the horizon. That one. Lucian followed her gaze. The Iron Crown, he said, using the shifter name. It signifies the burden of leadership. Is it heavy? She asked, turning to look at his profile. The crown. Lucian was silent for a long moment. The moonlight washed out the color of his skin, making him look like a marble statue. Beautiful and cold, it was, he admitted, his voice hollow, until my pack was slaughtered. Now, the weight is not of ruling, but of remembering. I carry their ghosts, Mira. Every day. He looked at his hands, turning them over. Sometimes I feel I failed them. I was captured, I was chained, you survived. Mira said firmly. She reached out, covering his large hand with her smaller one. You endured. That takes more strength than fighting. Lucian looked at their joined hands. He turned his palm up, interlacing his fingers with hers. The contrast was stark. His hand was large, scarred, and powerful. Hers was small, pale, and roughened by domestic labor. Yet they fit together perfectly. He shifted, turning his body toward her. The movement was fluid, carrying that inherent animalistic grace. He lifted his free hand and reached for her hair. Mira held her breath. Lucian didn't caress her cheek. Instead, he buried his fingers into the hair at the nape of her neck. He began to comb through the long, dark strands, his nails lightly grazing her scalp. It was a grooming behavior, instinctual, primal. Among wolves, this was an act of intimacy, of claiming, of caretaking. He worked through a tangle with surprising patience, his focus absolute. The sensation sent shivers cascading down Mira's spine, terrifying and electric. Your scent changes when you are near me, Lucian murmured, his eyes tracking the movement of his own hand through her hair. It becomes sweeter, warmer. Mira's voice failed her. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat she was sure he could hear. He leaned closer. He inhaled the scent of her hair, his nose brushing against her temple. Do you fear me, Mira? No, she whispered. Do you fear this? He tugged gently on her hair, tipping her head back. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were dark pools of violet fire, burning with a hunger that was not for food. He looked at her mouth. The air between them vanished. The cold of the night was forgotten, replaced by the scorching heat of his proximity. Mira wanted him. The desire was a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. She wanted to bridge the gap, to taste the wildness on his lips, to be consumed by the fire he offered. She leaned in, her eyelids fluttering shut. Clank. The memory of a sound echoed in her mind. The sound of the iron keys hitting the stone floor. The sound of her father's sharpening stone. Shh, clack. She froze. The image of Garrick's face twisted in hate, holding a flaying knife flashed before her eyes. You are soft. You are weak. You are a traitor. She wasn't just a woman. She was the daughter of the man who had tortured Lucian. Her blood was the blood of his tormentor. How could she kiss him with the same mouth that shared a genetic shape with the monster who skinned wolves? No, she gasped. She pulled back sharply, scrambling away from him on the rock. Lucian froze, his hand left suspended in the air where her hair had been. The rejection hit him physically. His pupils contracted, and a low, wounded sound died in his throat. Mira. I can't. she stammered, wrapping her cloak tighter around herself as if it were armor. She couldn't look at him. I am Garrick's daughter. You shouldn't. I shouldn't. You think I care about your lineage? Lucian growled, his voice dropping, the frustration evident. I see you, but I see him, Mira cried, tears stinging her eyes. When I look in the mirror, I see his eyes, I see his chin. I carry the blood of the hunter, Lucian. You are a king of the wild. I am just the jailer's kin. She stood up, her legs trembling. I can't be what you want. I am poison to you. She turned and fled back into the cave, leaving the warmth of the moment to die in the freezing air. Lucian remained on the ledge. He didn't chase her. He sat perfectly still, the wind whipping his silver hair across his face. He looked at his hand, the one that had held hers, and then clenched it into a fist. His knuckles turned white. His eyes began to glow, the violet light piercing the darkness. He turned his gaze toward the forest below, toward the distant, invisible path that led back to the village. His hearing, sharp and supernatural, picked up a sound miles away, the baying of hounds, not wild wolves. Dogs. Hunting dogs. Lucian stood up, the romantic tension replaced instantly by a lethal, cold clarity. The lesson on listening had been timely. The vibration between worlds had shifted. The peace was over. Chapter 7. Exposure. The silence inside the cave was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. Mira sat on her pile of furs, her knees drawn to her chest, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The heat of Lucian's near touch still lingered on her skin like a phantom burn, warring with the icy knot of shame in her stomach. She had run from him. She had run from the only creature who had ever looked at her and seen her, not just a pair of useful hands, but she couldn't unsee the blood on her own history. Every time she looked at her hands, she saw her father's grip. Every time she looked at Lucian's scars, she saw her inheritance. I am protecting him, she told herself, the lie tasting like ash. He deserves a queen, not the daughter of his executioner. Suddenly, the light from the entrance was blocked. Lucian appeared. He didn't walk in with the slow, prowling grace of the last few days. He moved with a blurred, kinetic urgency, sliding into the cavern like a shadow detached from the wall. He was shirtless, the bandages on his torso stark white against his skin. But he didn't seem to feel the cold. His entire body was vibrating a low-frequency tremor of muscles coiling for violence. "Put out the fire," he commanded. His voice was not the deep rumble of the lover who had combed her hair minutes ago. It was the sharp crack of a commander. Mira scrambled up, her heart leaping into her throat. What? Why? Smother it. Now. Lucian didn't wait for her. He kicked dirt over the embers, stomping out the last flickers of orange light until the cave was plunged into absolute darkness. Save for the faint phosphorescence of the moss above, he grabbed Mira's arm. His grip was bruising, devoid of tenderness, fueled entirely by adrenaline. He hauled her away from the entrance, pushing her toward the back of the cave where the rock narrowed into a fissure. "Lucian, you're scaring me," Mira whispered, clutching his forearm. "What is it? Listen," he hissed. Mira strained her ears. At first, she heard only the thunder of the waterfall and the blood rushing in her own skull. But then, drifting through the curtain of water, came a sound that turned her blood to ice. Baying. It was a chaotic, wet, throaty sound. The sound of dogs who had caught a scent. "Wolves," she breathed, hoping against hope. "Hounds," Lucian corrected grimly. "Bloodhounds. Bred for the hunt. And they are not alone." He moved to the side of the entrance, pressing his back against the stone, peering through the veil of water. His eyes were glowing again, two distinct points of violet light cutting through the gloom. His upper lip curled back, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too long to be human. "How?" Mira asked, her voice trembling. "The water. It hides the scent, the snow covers the tracks." "How did they find us?" Lucian turned to her. His expression was a terrifying mix of fury and realization. He leaned in, sniffing the air around her, not romantically this time, but analytically, He narrowed his eyes. Mira froze. What? The medicine you put on my burns. The poultice. He gestured to his neck. Winter shade and crushed calendula. It has a scent, Mira. A scent that does not belong in a pine forest. The realization hit Mira like a physical blow to the gut. The world swayed. She hadn't been tracked because of a footprint. She hadn't been found because she was clumsy. They were here because she had tried to heal him. The very herbs she used to soothe his pain had acted as a beacon, guiding the hunters straight to their sanctuary. Her compassion was the breadcrumb trail. I did this, she whispered, horror flooding her veins. I led them here. Quiet. Lucian snapped. Outside, the baying changed pitch. It became a frantic, excited yipping. They were close. Check the perimeter. A voice boomed over the roar of the water. Mira flinched. She would know that voice in her nightmares. It was gravel. And spite. It was Garrick. They are behind the falls. Garrick roared. The scent is strongest here. Surround the pool. Archers to the ridge. Lucian stepped away from the wall. He rolled his shoulders, the joints popping audibly. He looked at his hands, flexing his fingers. His nails were lengthening, turning dark and obsidian hard. The transformation was teasing the edges of his humanity, the beast clawing to get out. Lucian. Mira gasped, grabbing his arm. You can't fight them. You're not healed. You're barely at half strength. He looked down at her. The violet fire in his eyes softened, for a fraction of a second, just enough to show the man beneath the monster. I do not need to win, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. I only need to buy you time. No. Mira gripped him tighter. You have no choice, he said. Get behind me. Stay in the shadows. Do not move unless I tell you to run. He didn't wait for an argument. He turned and walked out onto the ledge. The scene outside was a vision from hell. Dozens of torches cast a jagged, bleeding light across the snow, turning the pristine white into the color of a fresh wound. The flickering flames reflected off the icy stalactites, creating a dizzying array of shadows that danced violently against the cliff face. At the base of the waterfall, standing on the frozen banks of the pool, were 20 men. They were heavily armed crossbows leveled, spears lowered. Iron chains coiled over shoulders. The dogs, massive mastiffs with spiked collars, strained at their leashes, foam dripping from their jowls as they snapped at the mist. And in the center of them stood Garrick. He wore his heavy wolf pelt cloak, a grotesque trophy of his past kills. In his hand was not a sword, but a modified musket, a heavy, iron-barreled weapon designed to punch through armor and bone. When Lucian stepped through the waterfall, the water sluicing off his bare shoulders and platinum hair, the dogs went berserk, but the men went silent. They had expected a monster. They had expected a frothing beast on all fours. They did not expect a man who looked like a fallen god, standing half-naked in the freezing mist, radiating an aura of lethal, regal power. Lucian stood tall on the ledge, looking down at them. He did not shiver, he did not cower. He looked at the armed mob with a sneer of absolute contempt. You trespass. Lucian's voice boomed. It wasn't a shout, but it carried over the roar of the waterfall, amplified by the acoustics of the stone. It vibrated in the chests of the men below. Garrick stepped forward, squinting up at the ledge. He raised his torch. So. The hunter sneered. His yellow teeth bared in a grin. The beast wears a man's skin tonight. I almost didn't recognize you without the chains, pup. Lucian's eyes narrowed. Leave this place, Garrick, or the snow will drink your blood. Empty threats from a cornered animal. Garrick laughed, though the sound was brittle. He gestured to the men around him. Look at him. He bleeds. He is weak. The silver ate his strength. He is nothing but a man tonight. The hunters shifted, emboldened. Crossbows were raised. Where is she? Garrick shouted, his voice losing its mocking edge and sharpening into anger. Where is the thief? Lucian moved. He didn't attack. He shifted his stance, widening his footing, making himself a larger target. He blocked the entrance to the cave completely with his body. There is no one here but death, Lucian growled. Liar. Garrick spat. He pointed the barrel of his gun at Lucian's chest. My dogs don't track ghosts. They track the stench of my own pantry. They track the traitor. He took a deep breath, his face twisting into a mask of possessive rage. Mira. I know you are in there. Come out. Step away from the beast. And I will only break your hand for stealing the key. Stay. And I will let the dogs tear you apart along with him. Inside the cave, Mira pressed herself against the cold stone. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release. He will kill him, she realized with crystal clarity. If I stay hidden, Garrick will open fire. Lucian will die shielding me. She looked at the back of Lucian's head. He was shaking not from cold, but from the effort of holding the shift back, of maintaining his human form to communicate, to negotiate. He was vulnerable. She couldn't let him die for her mistakes. Mira took a breath. It tasted of damp stone and fear. She wiped the tears from her cheeks. She stepped out. She emerged from the waterfall's mist, moving to stand beside Lucian. She was small compared to him, wrapped in a tattered cloak, her hair wild and windblown. But she stood straight. Mira. Lucian snarled, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the crossbows. No, she said softly. A ripple went through the crowd of hunters. To see the master hunter's daughter standing shoulder to shoulder with the Silver King, it was a blasphemy against everything they had been taught. Garrick stared up at her. His face went purple, the veins in his neck bulging. The sight of her alive, unharmed, and clearly aligned with the enemy seemed to break something in his mind. You! Garrick choked out. You whore! You stand beside it? Beside the thing that would eat your heart. He has never tried to hurt me. Mira called down, her voice surprisingly steady. He has only shown me kindness, which is more than I can say for you, father. The silence that followed was deafening. The wind howled through the canyon. He is a monster. Garrick screamed, shaking his weapon. He is a beast of the void. He has no soul. Look at him. Mira shouted back, gesturing to Lucian. Look at him, and tell me he is a monster. He is a king. And you are just a butcher. She looked at the men surrounding the pool men she had known all her life. The baker's son, the smith. Is this what you hunt? A man who healed? A man who protects. Some of the men lowered their crossbows slightly, exchanging uneasy glances. The narrative was crumbling. They had come to kill a rabid wolf, not a man defending a woman. Garrick saw the hesitation in his ranks. Panic and rage flared in his eyes. He was losing control. She is bewitched, Garrick roared. The beast has clouded her mind with magic. He is using her as a shield. Kill him now and free her. Wait. Mira screamed, stepping in front of Lucian. Move, Mira. Lucian roared, grabbing her shoulder to pull her back. But Garrick didn't wait. He didn't care about freeing her. He cared about erasing the stain on his honor. Fire. Garrick commanded. He squeezed the trigger of his musket. The boom was deafening, echoing off the canyon walls like a cannon shot. Time seemed to slow down. Mira saw the flash of the muzzle. She felt Lucian's hand on her shoulder, wrenching her backward with impossible force. She hit the stone floor of the ledge hard, the air knocked from her lungs. A sound ripped through the air, a wet, sickening impact. Mira scrambled up, her ears ringing. Lucian was still standing. But he was swaying. A dark, blossoming stain was spreading rapidly across the left side of his chest. Just below the shoulder. The heavy iron slug had punched through his human flesh. He looked down at the wound, his expression one of mild surprise. Then he looked up at Garrick. The violet light in his eyes exploded. The man vanished. With a roar that shook the icicles from the cliffs, the silver wolf erupted from the human form. The transformation was not slow this time. It was violent, instantaneous, and fueled by pure, unadulterated rage. Lucian, now a tower of silver fur and muscle, didn't fall. He launched himself from the ledge. He leaped into the air, a streak of silver lightning. descending upon the hunters who dared to touch what was his. Chapter 8. The confrontation of trust. The impact of the silver wolf hitting the frozen earth shook the ground like a falling boulder. Lucian didn't land with the clumsy stagger of a wounded animal. He landed with the terrifying precision of an apex predator. The snow erupted around him in a blinding white curtain, momentarily obscuring his form. When the powder settled, he was a nightmare made of silver and shadow, crouching low, his lips peeled back to reveal fangs the size of daggers. The hunting dog's massive mastiffs, bred to tear bears apart, did not attack. They did the one thing Garrick had never trained them to do. They broke. The moment Lucian's paws touched the ground, a shock wave of alpha dominance rolled over the clearing. It was a scent, a sound, a psychic weight that pressed down on every lesser creature. The mastiffs whimpered, tucking their tails between their legs and flattening their bellies to the snow. Whining in submission to a king. "Hold the line." Garrick screamed, struggling to keep his footing as his own dog dragged him backward. "Shoot him! He bleeds." A loose volley of crossbow bolts whistled through the air. Most went wide, the hunter's hands shaking too badly to aim. One bolt struck Lucian's flank, but the thick winter coat and the dense muscle beneath turned it away. It tangled in his fur, dangling uselessly. But the bullet wound. That was different. From the ledge above, Mira watched with her heart in her throat. The silver fur on Lucian's left shoulder was matted with dark, slick blood. The iron slug from her father's gun was lodged deep. Every breath Lucian took was a ragged heave of his ribs, and yet, he did not retreat. He stood like a statue of vengeance, placing his massive body between the hunters and the path up to the cave. He was guarding her. Even now. "No," Mira whispered. The word was a puff of steam in the freezing air. She couldn't stay up here. She couldn't watch him die for her. She scrambled toward the side of the waterfall, where the rock face was jagged and steep. She didn't think about the drop. She didn't think about the ice slicking the stones. She grabbed a root, swung her legs over, and began to slide and climb down the precipice. "Mira." Garrick's voice cut through the chaos below. He had spotted her movement. "Get down here, girl, before the beast turns on you." Mira's boots hit the snow at the base of the pool. The impact jarred her teeth, but she didn't stop. She ran. She didn't run away from the danger. She ran into the center of it. "Mira, stop," Garrick roared, lowering his gun slightly, his eyes wide with disbelief. She skidded to a halt in the no-man's land between the line of trembling hunters and the massive, growling wolf. The air in the clearing was electric with tension. On one side, 20 men with steel and fire. On the other, a creature of myth, bleeding and cornered. And in the middle, a girl in a torn dress, shivering not from cold, but from adrenaline. Lucian let out a low, warning rumble. He took a limping step forward, trying to nudge her behind him with his nose. "Get back," the gesture commanded. "You are exposed." Mira ignored him. She reached out, placing her hand on his massive shoulder, right near the bullet wound. The heat radiating from him was intense, burning through her frozen palm. His fur was coarse and wet with blood. But beneath it, she felt the steady, thundering rhythm of his heart. She looked at her father. Garrick stood 10 paces away. The wind whipped his cloak around him, making him look like a dark carrion bird. His face was a mask of confusion that was slowly curdling into a twisted sort of pity. "Look at you," Garrick sneered, gesturing with the barrel of his gun. "Standing in the mud with a wild animal. You've lost your mind, Mira. The isolation. It has broken you." "I have never been clearer," Mira said, her voice shaking but her chin held high. "He is manipulating you." Garrick stepped closer, his voice dropping to a wheedling, reasonable tone that terrified her more than his shouting. "It's a trick, child. Shifters are deceivers. He wears a handsome face to lure you in. But look at him now. Look at the monster. He doesn't love you. He wants to eat you." Mira felt Lucian stiffen under her hand. A growl vibrated through his chest, a deep, tectonic sound that shook the snow from the nearby branches. He was ready to launch himself at Garrick's throat, regardless of the gun. Mira squeezed his fur, a silent plea for him to wait. He could have killed me a dozen times. Mira said, her voice gaining strength. In the dungeon. In the woods. In the cave. He had every chance. He is strong enough to snap my neck with a thought. Yet, I am here. Alive. She took a step forward, putting deeper distance between herself and the wolf, shielding his wounded shoulder with her own body. You, father. She continued, tears stinging her eyes. You raised me. You fed me. But you also told me I was weak. You told me my compassion was a defect. You struck me when I cried for the deer we killed. You locked a living soul in a cage and planned to skin him for a cloak. It is the way of nature. Garrick barked, his patience fraying. The strong take. The weak serve. I made you hard so you could survive. You made me lonely, Mira screamed back. The sound echoed off the cliff walls, startling the hunters. You made me afraid of my own heart. She turned her head, looking back at Lucian. The wolf was watching her with those violet eyes, intelligent, sorrowful, and fiercely proud. In them, she saw the reflection of the man who had combed her hair. She saw the king who had bowed his head to let her ride. She looked back at her father. In his eyes, she saw only possession. She was just another thing he owned. Like his gun. Like his dogs, like the trophy he wanted to make of Lucian. Come here, Mira. Garrick commanded, extending his hand. It was a demand, not an offer. Step away from the beast. This is your last chance. Come home, and we will forget this madness. We will cleanse you of his taint. The hunters shifted their feet, the snow crunching loudly. They were waiting for her choice. The wind held its breath. Mira looked at her father's hand, the hand that had bruised her arm, the hand that had held the whip, the hand that held the key to the cage. Then she looked at the wolf's paw, huge, lethal, stained with mud, yet the same paw that had gently pinned her to the ground to keep her warm. The choice wasn't about safety. It wasn't about survival. It was about what kind of human she wanted to be. Mira took a breath. It was sharp and cold, filling her lungs with the scent of pine and blood. No, she said. Garrick blinked. What? I said no. Mira took a deliberate step backward. She didn't walk away from the danger. She walked backward until her shoulder bumped against the heaving, fur-covered chest of the silver wolf. She reached up, tangling her fingers deep into his mane. She felt Lucian lower his head, his heavy jaw resting protectively over her shoulder, his hot breath steaming against her neck. They stood as one entity. Beauty and the beast, united against the world. You call him a monster, Mira said, her voice quiet now, deadly calm. But a monster is one without a heart. A monster is one who destroys beauty because he cannot possess it. She looked Garrick dead in the eye. He is not the monster, father. You are. Garrick's face went slack. The rejection hit him harder than a bullet. His daughter, his property, had not just disobeyed him. She had looked into the abyss and chosen it over him. The shock on his face curdled instantly into a black, murderous rage. The veins in his forehead bulged. The facade of the concerned father vanished, replaced by the hunter, who had been denied his kill. So be it. Garrick whispered. The sound like a knife being drawn from a sheath. He raised the musket. He didn't aim at the wolf this time. He aimed at the space between them. He didn't care who he hit anymore. If he couldn't have her obedience, he would have her silence. If you choose the beast, Garrick roared, his finger tightening on the trigger. Then you die with the beast, Lucian, Mira screamed. But the wolf was already moving. Chapter 9. A bloodless victory. The explosion of gunpowder was deafening, a crack of thunder that should have heralded death. Mira flinched, her eyes squeezing shut against the inevitable impact of the bullet. But the blow never came. Instead, the world dissolved into a blur of silver violence. Lucian had moved faster than the mechanical fall of the hammer. Even wounded, with a lead slug buried in his shoulder, the Alpha's speed was a thing of supernatural terror. He didn't lunge at the gun, he lunged at the man. There was a sickening crunch, the sound of wood and bone colliding with massive force. Garrick was lifted off his feet, his finger jerking harmlessly on the trigger as the musket discharged into the snowy canopy above, sending a shower of pine needles raining down like green confetti. The master hunter slammed into the frozen earth 10 feet away, the breath driven from his lungs in a wheezing gasp. His weapon spun away, skittering across the ice of the pool's edge and vanishing into the black water. Before the other hunters could process that their leader had fallen, Lucian was upon him. The silver wolf stood over Garrick's prone form, a mountain of bristling fur and lethal intent. He planted one massive paw on Garrick's chest, pinning him to the mud with the weight of a boulder. He lowered his head, his jaws parting to reveal the ivory row of teeth that could snap a femur as easily as a dry twig. Lucian inhaled, scenting the terror radiating from the man beneath him. Then, he unleashed the roar. It was not a sound that belonged to the natural world. It did not come from his throat alone. It seemed to erupt from the earth itself, channeling through his body. It was a deep, resonant vibration that rattled the teeth in Mira's skull and shook the snow from the cliffs. It was the voice of the king. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The hunting dogs, already wavering in their loyalty, shattered. The genetic memory of the wolf, the grandfather of their kind, overwrote years of human training. With high-pitched yelps of panic, they turned on their heels, scrambling over each other, snapping their leashes, and fleeing into the dark forest. Tails tucked between their legs, the men fared little better. The roar struck a primal chord in their hindbrains, the reptilian instinct that remembered when humans were prey. They dropped their crossbows, they stumbled back, covering their ears, their faces drained of blood. "Back!" one of the men screamed, dropping his spear. The line broke. The discipline Garrick had drilled into them for years evaporated in the face of true, unbridled power. They didn't attack. They scattered, retreating to the edge of the clearing, eyes wide with horror. Only Garrick remained, pinned beneath the beast. He stared up into the violet eyes of the wolf, his face a rictus of shock. He scrambled at his belt for his knife, his hand shaking uncontrollably. Lucian snarled, a wet, guttural sound. He lowered his muzzle inches from Garrick's throat. A drop of saliva, mixed with blood from Lucian's own mouth, dripped onto Garrick's cheek. The wolf's intent was clear. One movement, and I rip it out. Lucian? No. The scream cut through the haze of bloodlust. Mira ran forward. She didn't run to her father. She ran to the wolf. She didn't fear the beast that was currently threatening to decapitate the master hunter. She feared what the kill would do to his soul and to hers. "Don't do it," she cried, skidding to a halt beside them. She reached out, burying her hands in the thick ruff of Lucian's neck, right near the pulsing jugular. "Lucian! Look at me!" The wolf froze. His ears swiveled backward, locking onto her voice. The growl in his chest didn't stop, but it lowered in pitch. He kept his eyes fixed on Garrick's throat, the muscles in his jaw bunching. "He deserves it." The tension in his body said. "He hunted us. He tortured me. He tried to kill you. I know." Mira wept, pulling on his fur. "I know he does. But if you kill him now, you prove him right. You become the monster he told everyone you were." Garrick, sensing the hesitation, let out a breathless, mocking laugh. Even facing death, his pride was a poisonous thing. "Do it, beast." Garrick wheezed, staring up at the wolf. "Spill my blood. Let her see you for what you are. A killer. An animal." Lucian's lips peeled back further. The provocation was working. The urge to silence that hateful voice was overwhelming. Mira looked at her father. She saw the madness in his eyes, the absolute refusal to accept defeat. He would rather die than admit he was wrong. He would rather be a martyr to his own bigotry than a father to her. A cold, steely resolve settled over her. "No," Mira whispered. "He doesn't get to be a martyr." She released Lucian's fur and reached into the deep pocket of her apron. Her fingers closed around the heavy clay pot she had packed days ago, a mixture she had ground from the dried puffball mushrooms found in the cave and the concentrated nightshade dust she had stolen from the manor. She had meant it for a peaceful sleep. But mixed with the ash she had added, it was a weapon of a different kind. "Lucian," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. Release him. The wolf flicked his eyes toward her, confused. Trust me, she implored. Let him up. Slowly, with a rumble of reluctance that shook his entire frame, Lucian lifted his paw. He stepped back, positioning himself between Garrick and Mira, his body a coiled spring ready to strike if the man so much as twitched. Garrick gasped, sucking in greedy lungfuls of air. He rolled onto his side, coughing, then scrambled to his knees. He looked at his knife on the ground, then at the gun in the water, then at Mira. His face twisted. He didn't look grateful. He looked betrayed. You spare me. Garrick spat, wiping mud from his chin. You think you are merciful. You are weak, Mira. You are a traitor to your own blood. I should have drowned you at birth. He lunged for the knife. Mira didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She hurled the clay pot. It struck the stone directly in front of Garrick's knees and shattered. Poof. A dense, billowing cloud of gray-white dust exploded outward, engulfing Garrick instantly. It wasn't smoke. It was a heavy, particulate fog that hung in the air, clinging to moisture. Garrick roared in anger, swinging his knife blindly through the cloud, but the roar turned into a cough. Then a choke. What is... He staggered, his legs turning to rubber. The concentrated nightshade and poppy dust, inhaled directly into the lungs, worked with terrifying speed. It was the same dose she had used to put a 200-pound man to sleep for hours, but this time, it was airborne and immediate. Garrick's eyes rolled back in his head. He dropped the knife. He took a step toward Mira, his hand outstretched as if to strangle her, but his knees buckled. He collapsed face forward into the snow, twitching once before going still. The cloud began to drift toward the other hunters at the edge of the clearing. Hold your breath. Mira screamed at them. Unless you want to sleep for a week. The remaining men didn't need to be told twice. Seeing their leader drop as if struck by lightning, and seeing the massive silver wolf standing over the witch daughter who commanded the air itself, their resolve evaporated completely. They broke and ran. They scrambled up the ridge, slipping on the ice, abandoning their weapons and their dignity in a desperate bid to escape the cursed waterfall. Silence crashed back into the clearing. The only sounds were the rushing water, the wind in the pines, and the ragged, heavy breathing of the wolf. Mira stood over her father. He was alive, she could see the slow, deep rise and fall of his back, but he was deep in the void of a chemically induced oblivion. She looked down at him. For 20 years, this man had been her god and her jailer. He had defined her world. He had told her who she was. Small, weak, useful only for service. But looking at him now, unconscious, defeated, lying in the mud while she stood tall, she realized he was just a man. A small, bitter man consumed by a hatred that had eaten him hollow. I am not weak, father, she whispered to his sleeping form. And I am not yours. She turned away. Lucian was waiting. He had shifted his stance. He was no longer the combatant. He was the mount. He stood with his side to her, his head lowered, watching the tree line to ensure no one returned. The blood on his shoulder was bright red against the silver, a stark reminder of the cost of her freedom. You're hurt, Mira said, her voice trembling as the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the shakes. Lucian huffed, a soft sound. He nudged her hip with his nose, hard enough to make her stumble slightly toward his back. We go. Now. He was right. The drug wouldn't last forever. And the hunters would return with reinforcements. They had to vanish. Mira grabbed a handful of his mane. She used his shoulder as a step, swinging her leg over his broad back. She settled behind his shoulders, avoiding the wound, and wrapped her arms around his powerful neck. The heat of him was a balm against the freezing night. It was the only anchor she had left in the world. Take us home, Lucian, she whispered into his ear. Wherever that is. Lucian didn't roar this time. He didn't look back at the fallen hunter. He turned toward the north, toward the deep, untouched wilderness where the snow lay thick and the trees grew old. He broke into a run. It wasn't the frantic, terrified dash of their escape from the dungeon. This was a steady, ground-eating lope of a creature who knew he had won. They left the waterfall behind. They left the village, the manor, the expectations, and the fear. As they crested the ridge, Mira dared to look back one last time. The torchlights of the hunters were distant fireflies, fading into the dark. Her father was a speck in the snow, a ghost of her past. She buried her face in the silver fur of the Wolf King. Inhaled the scent of pine and blood and freedom. And for the first time in her life, she didn't look back again. The journey into the deep north was a blur of endurance. Lucian ran for hours. He ran until the moon set, and the gray light of dawn began to bleed through the trees. He ran until the adrenaline faded and Mira could feel the hitch in his stride as the pain of the bullet wound began to truly set in. The terrain changed. The dense, claustrophobic forest gave way to a wider, wilder valley. The snow here was waist-deep, pristine and white, untouched by human boots. Finally, Lucian slowed. He staggered, his front leg buckling momentarily before he caught himself. "Lucian, stop," Mira cried, sliding off his back before he could collapse. "Please, you have to rest." They were in a small grove of aspen trees, their white bark ghostly in the morning mist. Lucian stood trembling, his head hanging low, his tongue lolling. The blood on his shoulder had frozen into a dark crust, but fresh red was seeping through. He looked at her. The violet light in his eyes was dim, flickering like a dying candle. He needed to shift. The wolf form was powerful, but the human form was needed for the fine manipulation of healing and to conserve the massive energy the alpha form consumed. He lay down in the snow, his eyes locking onto hers with an apology. The transformation took him. It was slower this time, agonizing to watch. The silver light was weak, sputtering. The bones shifted with wet, grinding sounds that made Mira wince. When the light faded, Lucian lay naked in the snow, shivering violently. The bullet hole in his human shoulder was an ugly, puckered ruin, dark with bruising. Mira was on him instantly. She whipped off her cloak, the same one she had worn since the dungeon, and draped it over him. "I've got you," she murmured, her hands moving instinctively to check his temperature, his pulse. "I'm here." Lucian's eyes fluttered open. He looked up at the canopy of trees, then at her face hovering above him. He reached up, his hand cold and weak, and touched her cheek. "You," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "You threw the dust." "I did." Mira managed a watery smile, taking his hand and pressing it to her face to warm it. "You chose," he whispered. "You chose the monster." Mira shook her head, tears spilling over to track hot lines through the dirt on her face. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, mirroring the gesture he had given her in the dungeon so many nights ago. "No, Lucian," she said fiercely. He let out a long breath, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire exile leaving his body. His eyes drifted shut, his body going limp as exhaustion finally claimed him. "Then I am yours," he breathed into the silence. "Forever." Mira sat back on her heels, surrounded by the vast, silent winter. She was cold, she was homeless, and she was guarding a fallen king in the middle of nowhere. But as the first rays of the sun crested the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose, Mira realized she had never been richer. She began to gather wood. She had a patient to heal. Chapter 10. Journey North. The silence of the high north was not empty. It was heavy. It pressed against the eardrums, a vast, white blanket that muffled the world, broken only by the crack of freezing sap in the ancient pines and the ragged breathing of the two figures huddled in the snow. In the shelter of the aspen grove, time seemed to contract to a single, bloody point of focus. Mira knelt in the snow, her hands stained crimson. Lucian lay before her, his human form pale as the drifts surrounding them, shivering with the onset of shock. The lead slug from her father's gun was still lodged deep in the muscle of his shoulder. A poisonous seed that had to be removed before the wolf's supernatural healing closed the flesh over it. "This is going to hurt," Mira whispered, her voice trembling. She held her small paring knife, the one she used for cutting herbs, in the flame of the small fire she had managed to kindle. The metal glowed dull orange. Lucian opened his eyes. They were glazed, the violet irises swimming in a pool of pain, but they fixed on her with unwavering trust. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers curling around her knee. "Do it," he rasped, his voice a grinder of gravel. "I will not break." Mira took a breath, steeling her heart. She was a healer. She had set bones and stitched furrows, but she had never cut into the flesh of a man she loved. Loved, the word surfaced in her mind, unbidden and terrifyingly true. She pushed it down. Now was not the time for sentiment. Now was the time for blood. "Bite down on this," she said, placing a thick roll of leather strap between his teeth. Lucian clamped his jaw shut. He nodded. Mira worked. She had to be brutal to be kind. She widened the wound with the heated blade, ignoring the hiss of searing flesh and the fresh welling of blood. Lucian's body went rigid. His back arched off the furs, every cord of muscle standing out in high relief. A sound tore from his throat, a muffled, animalistic roar that vibrated through the ground and into her own bones. He didn't pull away. He didn't strike out. He channeled the agony into the grip on her knee, squeezing until she thought her own bone might crack, but he kept his arm perfectly still for her. "Almost there." Mira gasped, sweat freezing on her brow. "I see it." She used the tip of the knife to leverage the flattened slug. With a sickening wet pop, the metal worked loose. Mira grabbed it with her fingers, ignoring the heat of the lead, and threw it into the snow. It hissed, melting a tiny crater in the white. "It's out," she sobbed, pressing a pad of moss and clean linen hard against the wound. "It's out, Lucian." Lucian spat the leather strap into the snow. He collapsed back against the furs, his chest heaving, his skin sheen with cold sweat. He turned his head toward her. "Mira." He breathed. He didn't ask about the wound. He reached up, his bloody hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away the tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "You have steady hands," he whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips before his eyes rolled back, and he slid into the dark, restorative sleep of the wolf. They stayed in the grove for 2 days while Lucian's body fought the iron poisoning. Mira didn't sleep. She kept the fire small and smokeless. She melted snow for water, and she curled her body around his to share her heat, acting as a human blanket against the biting wind. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Lucian woke not as a man, but with the sudden, fluid shift of the beast. Mira woke to find a massive silver wolf standing over her, nudging her awake with a wet nose. The wound on his shoulder was a jagged, hairless scar, pink and tender, but closed. He looked at the horizon. The storm clouds were gathering in the South Garrick's territory. "We move," his posture said. The journey that followed was a blur of white endurance. They moved deeper into the untamed wild, leaving the maps of men behind. The snow here was waist deep, impassable for a human on foot. So Mira rode. She spent her days clinging to Lucian's back, her face buried in the thick, silver fur of his neck to shield herself from the wind. He was a tireless engine of muscle and will. He ran with a loping, rhythmic stride that ate up the miles, his paws acting like snowshoes on the crust of the ice. They were a singular entity, the Wolf King and his rider. At night, they dug into the snowbanks, creating small, insulated dens. There was no space for modesty in the deep freeze. Lucian would shift back to human form to conserve the heat of the pack. A pack of 2. They slept entangled, limbs woven together, skin against skin. Mira learned the geography of his body, the ridge of his spine, the rough calluses of his hands, the erratic, thumping rhythm of his heart that slowed only when she hummed to him. "Where are we going?" she asked one night, tracing the new scar on his shoulder with her fingertip. "Home," Lucian murmured, his voice rumbling in his chest against her ear. "The valley of the Silvermane. It was the seat of my power before the hunters came. Before I was taken. Is anyone left?" Lucian went silent. His grip on her waist tightened. "I do not know. I felt their deaths when I was in the chains. But wolves are hard to kill. We endure." On the 7th day, the landscape changed. They climbed a narrow, treacherous pass between 2 soaring peaks that looked like the fangs of the world. The air was thin and sharp, making Mira dizzy. Lucian, in wolf form, moved carefully here, testing every foothold on the icy path. As they crested the summit, the wind died. Below them lay a hidden world. It was a vast, bowl-shaped valley, sheltered from the Arctic winds by the high crater walls. But what took Mira's breath away was the green. Geothermal vents steamed from the valley floor, misting the air and keeping the ground warm enough to melt the snow. Patches of hardy grass poked through the frost. A river, unfrozen and dark blue, wound through the center, and there, nestled against the far cliff, were ruins, ancient stone structures that had been reclaimed by moss and ivy. "It's beautiful," Mira whispered. Lucian let out a howl. It wasn't the roar of battle, it was a song. A long, mournful, rising note that carried the story of his captivity, his pain, and his return. It echoed off the canyon walls, filling the valley with the sound of the king. He waited. Silence. Mira felt his muscles tense beneath her. Had they all died? Was he the last? Then, from the ruins, a sound answered. A howl. Then another. Then a chorus. They were thinner, weaker than Lucian's, but they were unmistakably wolf. Lucian didn't run. He descended with regal slowness. He wanted them to see him. He wanted them to see her. As they reached the valley floor, the shadows of the ruins detached themselves. Wolves appeared. They were not the sleek, well-fed warriors of legend. They were gaunt, their fur matted, their eyes wide and wary. Some were missing ears, others walked with limps. They were the survivors, the runts. The ones who had hidden while the alpha was taken. There were perhaps 30 of them. They formed a loose circle, growling low in their throats as they looked at Mira. To them, she smelled of the enemy. She smelled of iron and gunpowder and the blood of the hunter. Lucian stopped. He allowed Mira to slide off his back. As soon as her boots hit the grass, a large gray wolf with a scarred ear lunged forward, snapping at her hem. Roar! Lucian intercepted the attack instantly. He didn't shift. He slammed his body into the gray wolf, knocking him rolling into the dirt. Lucian stood over him, baring his fangs, his hackles raised high. He snarled a correction so vicious that the gray wolf rolled onto its back, exposing its throat in absolute submission. Lucian turned to the circle. He looked at every single wolf, his violet eyes glowing with dominance. He stepped back to Mira's side and rubbed his flank against her thigh, marking her. "She is mine," the gesture screamed. "Touch her, and you challenge me." Then, the silver light took him. He shifted. The transition was smooth now, fueled by the ambient magic of the valley. He stood up, naked and proud, the wind catching his platinum hair. "I have returned." Lucian's voice boomed across the clearing. "I am Lucian Silvermane, first of the blood, breaker of chains." The wolves whined, their tails wagging tentatively. They recognized the voice. They recognized the scent. And this. Lucian continued, reaching out to take Mira's hand. He pulled her forward. Not behind him, but beside him. "This is Mira. She is the key. She is the healer. She is the one who broke the iron." He looked at the pack, his expression fierce. "She is not prey. She is not human. She is Luna." A silence stretched, heavy and tense. Mira held her breath, squeezing Lucian's hand so hard her knuckles turned white. She was a hunter's daughter standing in a den of wolves. Then, an old woman walked out from behind a crumbling stone archway. She was stooped, draped in tattered furs, her hair a shock of white. She was a shifter who had lost the ability to turn, trapped in her twilight years. She hobbled toward them, leaning on a staff. She stopped in front of Mira. She sniffed the air, taking in the scent of herbs, of fear, and of the deep, indelible scent of Lucian that clung to Mira's skin. The old woman looked at Lucian's healed shoulder. She saw the scar where the bullet had been a wound that should have killed him, healed by human hands. Slowly, painfully, the old woman lowered herself to her knees. She bowed her head to the dirt at Mira's feet. "Welcome home, Luna," she rasped. It broke the dam. One by one, the wolves lowered their bodies. The shifters in human form, children with dirt-smudged faces, men with hollow cheeks emerged from the ruins and bowed. They didn't see a hunter. They saw the woman who had brought their king back from the dead. Mira looked out at the sea of bowed heads. Tears blurred her vision. For 20 years, she had been invisible in her own home, a ghost haunting the halls of a man who despised her. Here, in the wild, among the monsters, she was seen. She was revered. She looked up at Lucian. He wasn't looking at the pack. He was looking at her. His gaze was soft, filled with a reverence that matched his people's. "You saved me, Mira," he whispered, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles. "Now, let us save them." Mira squeezed his hand back. She looked at the ruined valley, the starving pack, the broken stones. It was a mess. It was dangerous. It was perfect. "Yes," she said, her voice finding a new strength. The voice of a woman who had walked through fire and ice. "Let's get to work." The sun crested the peaks, flooding the valley of eternal spring with golden light, banishing the long, dark winter of their separation. Chapter 11. Epilogue. The Valley of Eternal Spring lived up to its name. A year ago, Mira had stumbled into this crater half-frozen, clinging to the back of a dying wolf, greeted by a starving, broken pack. Today, the valley hummed with a vibrancy that felt less like survival and more like a song. The geothermal vents that dotted the valley floor had been harnessed, channeling steam into the stone bathhouses the shifters had rebuilt. The ruins, once piles of moss-covered sorrow, were now sturdy homes of timber and stone, their chimneys sending curls of fragrant wood smoke into the crisp, high-altitude air. Mira stood at the window of her clinic, grinding dried chamomile and sun-bleached willow bark in a mortar. The clinic was her pride, a structure of white birch and glass, built by Lucian's own hands, perched on a rise that overlooked the winding blue river. She wiped her hands on her apron, no longer the tattered rag of a servant, but a garment of fine linen embroidered with the silver crest of the wolf. Outside, the sounds of the pack drifted up to her. It wasn't the silence of fear that had plagued her father's house, nor the whimpering of the dungeon. It was the sound of life, the rhythmic thwack of axes splitting wood, the splash of fishing nets hitting the water, and the high-pitched, joyous yipping of pups chasing each other through the tall grass. Mira paused, resting her hand on the cool stone sill. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she still dreamed of the cage. She dreamed of the cold stone floor, and the smell of iron, but then she would wake, and there would be a heavy arm draped over her waist, a furnace of heat pressed against her back, and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the king grounding her in reality. The door to the clinic creaked open. Mira didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The air in the room shifted instantly, becoming heavier, charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "You are working too hard." A deep voice rumbled. Lucian moved up behind her. He didn't walk. He flowed. Even after a year of peace, the Alpha retained his predatory grace. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. "And you are hovering," Mira teased, leaning back into him. "Shouldn't the king be presiding over the council of elders? The elders argue about fence lines and fish quotas." Lucian grumbled against her skin, his voice vibrating through her spine. "I prefer the company of my mate." He kissed the sensitive spot just below her ear, sending a shiver cascading down her legs. Mira turned in his arms, looking up at him. The year had been kind to Lucian. The gaunt, starved look of the prisoner was gone, replaced by the robust, powerful build of a ruler in his prime. His platinum hair was tied back with a leather cord, revealing the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face. The scars were still there, the faint silver lines on his neck from the collar, the puckered mark on his shoulder from the bullet, but they were no longer angry wounds. They were history written on skin, but it was his eyes that held her. The violet fire was still there, but the chaotic rage was gone, replaced by a deep, settled wisdom. "How is the patient?" Lucian asked, nodding toward the cot in the corner of the room. "Sleeping," Mira whispered. On the cot lay a young wolf pup, legs splinted and wrapped in bandages. He had taken a tumble from a ridge while trying to impress a female. "He will heal," Mira said softly. He has the resilience of his alpha. Lucian looked at the pup, his expression softening into a fierce protectiveness. He was foolish. Brave. But foolish. He was in love. Mira corrected, smoothing the lapels of Lucian's tunic. Love makes us do foolish things. Like stealing keys from a master hunter. Or riding a wild beast into a blizzard. Lucian chuckled a low, dark sound that Mira felt in her toes. He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. He kissed her fingertips, one by one, his eyes never leaving hers. It was not foolishness, Mira, he said intensely. It was destiny. The spirits of the ancestors guided you to that dungeon. They knew I could not save myself. Mira looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers small and stained with green herbs. I didn't save you because of the ancestors, she said quietly. I saved you because you were the first thing in my life that felt real. Lucian's gaze darkened with emotion. He pulled her closer, his grip tightening possessively on her waist. Do you miss it? He asked suddenly. The world below? The villages? The humans? Mira thought about it. She thought about the structured streets, the market days, the safety of anonymity. Then she thought of her father who had survived the night at the waterfall, only to be disgraced, his guild shattered by the rumors of a monster he couldn't kill. He was a ghost to her now. A bad memory fading in the sun. I miss chocolate, she admitted with a small smile. And sometimes I miss the library. But I do not miss the loneliness. Here. I am never alone. No, Lucian vowed, his forehead resting against hers. He pulled back slightly, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air around her. He frowned, a crease appearing between his brows. He leaned in again, sniffing at her hair, then lower, toward her neck and chest. Lucian. Mira laughed nervously, swatting at his shoulder. Stop it. You're being a wolf. You're scent. He murmured. Distracted. It has changed. Mira's heart skipped a beat. She went still. Lucian pulled back, holding her at arm's length. His violet eyes swept over her face, analyzing, calculating. He looked at the flush in her cheeks, the slight wariness around her eyes that she had blamed on the late nights in the clinic. It is sweeter, he whispered. Richer. Like milk and honey. He looked down at her stomach. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His pupils dilated, swallowing the violet until his eyes were almost black. His hands on her waist trembled not with weakness, but with the restraint of a sudden, overwhelming emotion. Mira, he breathed, the name cracking in the middle. Mira bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. She had suspected for weeks. The herbs she couldn't stand the smell of. The morning sickness she hid before he woke. But to have him know it, to have his primal senses confirm it before she could even say the words. She took his hand and placed it flat against her lower abdomen. We are going to need a bigger den, she whispered. Lucian didn't move. He didn't speak. He stared at his hand resting on her stomach as if it were the holiest relic in the world. The king who had faced armies, who had endured torture, who had rebuilt a civilization from dust, looked completely undone. Slowly, he dropped to his knees. He didn't care that they were in the middle of the clinic. He didn't care about his dignity. He pressed his face against her stomach, wrapping his massive arms around her hips, holding her as if she were made of glass. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. A pup, he mumbled into her dress. My blood. Your heart. A little monster. Mira joked through her tears, combing her fingers through his silver hair. Lucian looked up at her, his face radiant with a joy so pure it blinded her. No. A king. Or a queen. They will know no chains. Mira, they will know only this valley, and the love of their pack. He stood up, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. Lucian. Put me down. She squealed, clutching his shoulders. I can walk. You will not walk, he declared, striding toward the door. You are carrying the heir to the Silvermane. You will be carried. You will be fed the finest venison. You will sleep on a mountain of furs. I have patience. The patients can wait. They have immune systems. I have a celebration to plan. He carried her out of the clinic and onto the wooden veranda. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the valley. The snow on the peaks turned to pink fire. Below them, the pack had gathered for the evening meal. A massive bonfire was being lit in the center of the village. Lucian stepped to the railing, holding Mira high against his chest. He didn't need to shout. The pack sensed him. They stopped their work, their play, their conversations. 50 pairs of eyes, gold, brown, and green, turned upward to the clinic. Lucian looked down at his people. He looked at the thriving world they had built from the ashes of his captivity. And then he looked at the woman in his arms, the human girl who had stolen a key and unlocked a future. Tonight, Lucian roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. We feast. The pack erupted. Howls of joy rose into the twilight air. A cacophony of brotherhood and belonging that chased the last of the shadows away. Mira rested her head on Lucian's shoulder, watching the sparks from the bonfire rise up to meet the first stars. The winter was over. The hunt was done. She closed her eyes and listened. She didn't need to try hard anymore. She could hear it clearly now, the vibration between worlds. It sounded like a heartbeat. Strong, steady, and doubled. Here, at the edge of the world, in the heart of the Silver Wolf, Mira had finally found the one thing her father had never understood, the one thing that could tame a beast and heal a human: home.